Hey everyone, I wanted to do a video today on the topic of finding the optimal hemoglobin A1c value. I think many of us are aware of the importance of maintaining good glycemic control for optimizing health and lifespan, but the question then becomes, what's the right value to shoot for? The first thing I want to start off with talking about is what is hemoglobin A1c, and what it reflects clinically is basically the average blood sugar level that we have seen in our bodies over the last 3 months. Now, what it's actually measuring is basically how much sugar, effectively, or carbohydrate, has been attached to the red blood cells that are circulating in our body. And I actually think this is a pretty imperfect measure. There are things that can affect the natural turnover of red blood cells themselves that can cause this value to sway in one direction or another. And I actually prefer to measure blood sugar control via CGM. We can talk more about that in the future, but for the time being, A1c is the more common way to measure blood sugar control. Now, the next thing to consider is, well, what does the research show about what the optimal A1c values are? And, we know clinically that, an A1c of 6.5 or above is considered to be diagnostic of diabetes, and anything above 5.7 is diagnostic of prediabetes. And there's quite a bit of research that shows that these A1c values do correlate with a whole host of adverse health outcomes that we don't want to have. So we know that levels below that are definitely going to be desirable for most of us. Now, if we can set aside, those two values as being definitely points that we want to be below, the question then becomes, how much lower do we want to go? And for that, I think there's a couple of different ways to approach it. We can look at some of the literature that's been published around associations between hemoglobin A1c and outcomes like all-cause mortality. Then we can also look at some of the science and mechanisms behind how our cells and different organs utilize glucose and how different pathways are activated when glycation, which is a state of having glucose attached to the surface of a cell, how this affects cellular function. And what the literature shows is actually a little bit of a mixed picture. There have been many studies that have looked at the association of A1c and all-cause mortality, and there are some that suggest that the lower the A1c you have, the better the chance of avoiding an adverse outcome like mortality, the better chance you have. And I think that if some of you guys are fans of Peter Attia, I am too. He wrote an article several years ago talking about, from his review of the literature, he felt that the lower the A1c, the better the outcome. And he kind of advocates for really aggressive blood sugar control, shooting for an A1c of below 5.0. Now, there have been other studies, and there was even a recent meta-analysis published in 2022 that showed a J-shaped relationship between A1c and all-cause mortality. And this has been replicated by other meta-analyses and in other studies. And what this essentially shows is that in the band between 5 and 6 is where you have the best health outcomes. And once you start getting below 5, you start to see that increased risk of mortality kind of tick back up. So, what is one to do with this? Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not going to get into the details of critiquing studies and methods and study design. To be honest with you, I'm more interested in science, not really interested as much in epidemiology. It is a useful signal that we have to consider, but at the end of the day, we're all different. We have individual biology that is highly variable. And for me, what's more interesting to understand is, what are the mechanisms that are at play when it comes to our cells and our bodies that involve glucose? And for that, I've learned about a number of different roles that glucose plays in the body, some of which you probably know about, right? Like, we need to have glucose as an efficient energy source. It's used by the brain a lot just due to the energy intensity of that organ. But some other things you may not realize are that, glucose and glycation in particular play a key role in the health of certain organs, like the lungs, for example. So glycation is basically the process, I mentioned this earlier, the process by which glucose gets attached to a cell or cellular component. And this structure forms a signaling molecule. And so there is a receptor called the RAGE receptor, which attaches to glycated products, or AGEs, products. And so this receptor glycation product combination can then activate a whole host of signaling pathways that can be beneficial. And so a good example of this is in the lung. So the lung really depends on having activation of this RAGE cascade. So much so that there are some studies that have shown that having too low of an A1c, and to further back this up, there's even a study that shows that people with lung cancer have diabetes actually have higher, believe it or not, higher survival in the short term. So what does this all mean? Well, I think what it means is that the picture around glucose and A1c is not nearly as simple as we're led to believe. Glucose is not something you should aim to completely eliminate from your diet, to be very clear. Now, I will also acknowledge that most people, as a practical matter, are on the other side of the spectrum and could benefit from optimizing their glucose. And so where do I stand on what the optimal A1c is? And so for me, the answer is 5.4. 5.4 or below is where I sit. And so where that value comes from is a combination of what the literature suggests, where, again, with that J-shaped relationship, it's really that 5 to 6 range that you want to be in. And then also, and I think this is the other important part to mention, the practical application of all of this, which is to say that if somebody has an A1c of 5.4 or below, I have a pretty general good understanding, now that I've done enough CGM on people, of what their glucose profile looks like, what their dietary habits generally are. And someone with an A1c of 5.4 or below generally is going to be having a fasting glucose, in the 70s, 80s. They may spike up after certain meals into the low 100s. Again, this is why I really like CGM, because there's other things I like to look at that you can't get in an A1c, like glucose variability, like glucose excursions, peaks, that sort of thing that you're just not going to get. But in any case, as a first pass, if someone's A1c is 5.4, there isn't generally too much more that I'm going to do that's going to meaningfully move the needle on their goals. Or if I do, I'm often running into trade-offs where I'm starting to have them restrict their diet so much such that it becomes less sustainable, or I'm starting to impede nutrient intake of things like fruits and vegetables, where those a lot of them tend to have higher carbohydrate content, but they also have a lot of other benefits in terms of phytonutrients, antioxidants, that sort of thing. So as a practical matter, trying to push an A1c below 5.4 just generally doesn't yield as much benefit in my experience. And so this is why I shoot for 5.4. So that's just me. There are going to be doctors who disagree with me, who see things a different way. But, again, my approach is to always individualize and to tailor it to the individual. But in my experience, 5.4 and below is where most people kind of achieve the point of diminishing returns with respect to glucose control. So that's a little bit on glucose and A1c control. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.